because those were both, they could be undertaken by many decentralized actors. It's very, very, very hard to prevent a particular commodity company from sort of trying a plot in Iowa with GM corn, and the same way with some technology company from running nanotech experiments, even though there are significant external risks associated with those that need to be taken into account. So one issue is, geoengineering is going to be something that's much more observable, and I think observability is going to be an important issue of governance, but it's also not going to be, I don't expect that the climatic experimentation would be happening by many different private actors all over the world. So that's one difference in the structure. The other one, just very quickly to build on something Jason said, I think the intent point is a very interesting one, and it does bear on the research, because it also means that the research that needs to be done is precisely, the research that needs to be done from an effectiveness standpoint is precisely the research that needs to be done to alleviate some of the uncertainties and understand the risks. Whereas in GM crops or nanotech, there's sort of two tracks of research. One is, how can I build this little nanotech device, which is a kind of technical, and then the other one would be, what are the risks of that? And private actors don't have any incentive to do the second.
Is there, in fact, I mean, I'm ignorant about this, but is there, in fact, already any international governance mechanism, either for nanotechnology research or for geoengineering?
For geoengineering, so again, we've talked about the fact that there's different types of geoengineering in different categories. Solar radiation management, there is nothing. But under the carbon dioxide removal, one thing that did come up briefly in ocean iron fertilization, Richard raised the fact, this is a method for you put iron in the ocean or other nutrients to grow algae blooms or to grow basically biological material that ideally will sink to the bottom of the ocean and take carbon with it. But this is messing with an ecosystem effectively. And the London Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity both took this up in the last couple of years, both made rulings on it actually, and it came to an interesting question of which one has precedence. So that's the only case where there has been explicit governance of geoengineering, and it already raises the questions of what happens when you rush to govern with existing frameworks. Are they adequate? And even more importantly here, which one has precedence?
Tariq, just one last question to you. I mean, ask anybody outside this forum the question up there, how should research into geoengineering concepts be governed internationally? Most people, I think, would say, well, United Nations, obviously, they're the body that's already in the lead on all climate change debate. Now, we've seen over the last few days here in Copenhagen the huge difficulties that there are within the UN framework of trying to get a consensus. With that experience in mind, do you believe there is a specific UN body which might be able to take on this additional challenge?
Well, I don't know which part of your question to answer. First of all, on the difficulty of consensus or the particular body. But on the, let me just say, reiterate the point I made earlier. Getting a consensus on issues that are of such enormous long-range consequence and with enormously complex impacts and feedbacks is not something that we have ever underestimated. I think it has been even the reason that we are here today, although we wish that we were 100 years ahead of where we are today, even the fact that we are here today is because of a steady process of work that has been undertaken by the international community, largely but not exclusively, but where it matters under the aegis of the United Nations. And the two dimensions which have worked in parallel tracks and have tried to bring these together are the political process, starting with the UNFCCC and then going on to Kyoto and others, and then not the scientific, but the science policy interface process, which was the IPCC. And in fact, if you look at a number of other scientific panels, the same impeccable quality and the same degree of detail and research, their impact has been far more minimal and almost virtually non-existent. I mean, if you think of the Millennium Assessment or the World Energy Assessment, etc. And one of the reasons is that their inability to establish the science policy interface much more effectively. So in some sense, as far as the international community is concerned, the kind of legitimacy that we would need for anything to move forward is something that can come only from this process. But mind you, that the legitimacy actually begins by first asking the question whether it is necessary. I mean, in other words, I'm quite confident, as you said, that if you first immediately put the question, right now there would be a lot of opposition even to entertain the question, from the perspective that entertaining the question already implies a certain amount of legitimacy for particular outcomes. You know, if you don't want to go somewhere, you don't ask directions. I mean, you ask directions only if that's the direction that you want to go. Given that there is a huge level of distrust, and in fact, right now the slowness of the proceedings, and I don't mean the last 2 weeks or the last 2 years, you know, this entire period of the last 2 decades, as we have come to try to come to grips with many of the global problems emerged, the slowness of that process has actually sort of deepened many of the divides that exist today. So if you imagine a situation, take a country which has, let's say, limited scientific capacity and has the, you know, the kind of technical input that is necessary in order to make the equivalent political decisions. They are brought in to say, well, let's begin to think about this kind of a research. And then they know, well, this research will be done in the United States, in the European Union. Will it give them even more political power than it does today? Will it create, even further shift the balance of power? Their immediate reaction would be to try to slow it down, stop it, so that at least they can build up the capacity to understand it. And I think this is something we need to respect. We do need to find a way in which first we bring people on board and raise the level of comfort with both, not only the technical, but the politics of the technical work in order so that we can move ahead. I didn't answer your institutional question, but I can do that on
Exactly. Let's bring these people on board now. I see 2 hands over there, I see one over here and one down there.
Regulate, you already have a legal instrument and a UN process.
Thank you. I'll take, there was one more on that side.
The Economist. Under Jason's deck, is already governing geoengineering quite an sulfur in biofuels for ships, to such an extent that it will be removing 0.5 watts per square metre of cooling from the Earth's atmosphere over the next 10 years. Now that's quite a bit of warming of the Earth involved in that policy.
Okay, well, there's 2 suggestions there.
The problem is this: if we actually dismantle this thing called geoengineering and bring it down to a number of different components, then there are some components in which one can say there are existing institutional mechanisms. I mean, a simple thing is, of course, trees is also, massive plantation of forest is also a form of geoengineering. If we wanted to govern that or something, we would actually have existing institutional mechanisms through which it could proceed. Even if there were risks and others, we could manage them. The IMO can actually deal with particular elements in which these things can be done. The Convention of the Law of the Sea and all of its implementation, the sulfur filings and so forth. The problem is if you bundle them all together, and particularly you bring in the elements for which precedents are hard to find, that is really where the question marks would begin to go up, and people would begin to have a greater degree of discomfort with it. So I would say there are a number of existing mechanisms which can be used for particular things, but not for the umbrella thing. For the umbrella thing, I think generally the way it has worked, or many of these things have worked, is that it oftentimes worked through a General Assembly resolution. A number of countries get together, say, these are issues. Now we are going to convince all our fellow members of the General Assembly that this is an important issue on which a process needs to be started. I'll give you an example. This year, a number of countries, small island development states, passed a resolution last year on climate and security implications of climate change. Now, initially there was a lot of resistance to it because people said, what are you trying to put in and what process are you trying to do? But they carried that resolution, they convinced the people, they brought in a lot of the evidence, and in the end the resolution passed unanimously, and it has now started a process where some of the next steps can begin to get contemplated, and those next steps will then begin to identify the kind of institutions through which they would emerge. So some elements are there. If we can break it down, there are some things on which it can be moved faster. The larger issue will remain a major problematic issue, and it will require raising the comfort level of countries, and we do understand what the processes are through which it can happen.
I'll just add 2 really quick things. For NMOD, the potential is it might be there to use it as a legal instrument, but one of the questions you have to ask is, what has it been used for in the last 30 years since it was created? It doesn't have an active an active conference of the parties, nothing like what the UNFCCC has. It doesn't have the buy-in, it doesn't have the engagement that we have at the moment, nor does it necessarily have the active scientific body supporting it that you're going to need, again, something like the IPCC. So it may be a simple starting point, but it certainly in and of itself isn't an institution that would cover nearly all the issues that were raised. To Oliver's point, this really raises the question for me that I think the entire audience may want to think about of what really is geoengineering. Right now we've defined these technologies as things that have an intentional impact on the climate system that we would do that are new. But even mitigating is going to have an intentional impact on the climate system. And as Oliver has pointed out, here they're attempting to mitigate local air pollution by taking the sulfur out of the atmosphere. That has a negative consequential impact on the global climate. China cleaning up its local air pollution, cleaning up acid rain in Europe. All of these things are things that can actually reduce the shielding that we've had from these aerosol particles in terms of reflecting light away and lead to faster warming. We have not yet got a good mechanism. The UNFCCC is dealing particularly with carbon mitigations. It's not covering carbon black. It's not covering methane. It's certainly not covering aerosols. We don't yet have a framework that can holistically deal with all the things we're doing to the environment intentionally and unintentionally. How we deal with that poses a fundamentally new challenge for us, and maybe it's the General Assembly, though how fast is it? Is that sufficient? Does it have enough scientific support? These are open questions, and this is why it needs a much broader engagement in it.
I know both Nathaniel and Richard want to speak. Keep it brief if you would, because I do want to bring some more people in. Nathaniel.
So very quickly, I think just to echo the point on intent with respect to the sulfate, I think is very important. I think that seems to me that's akin to a lot of decisions people make. I mean, the decision on what energy source to use, wind and solar and tidal, and they may all have effects as well on other elements of the atmosphere, other elements of the environment, other environmental impacts and implications, and I would put that in the same bin rather than trying to treat everything, I think, as geoengineering. Also, on a technical point, and I hesitate to say this as a non-scientist, but my understanding is, on the flip side of that is certainly shipping in the near polar regions has black carbon impacts, which has the reverse effect. So how you're going to weigh those two, and you'd want to take that into the equation, I'm sure you understand. So that goes in the opposite direction, right? Removing diesel particles addresses the black carbon. Just very briefly on the MMOD point, I mean, I think we need to be thinking about regulations and regimes and norms for the scientific research. Certainly you could have a regime that said, thou shalt not throw sulfur particles into the atmosphere. But if we get to that point, and that's the only sort of backstop, that's just going to be extraordinarily hard. I don't think that's going to be particularly effective because it's a problem where once it happens, you can sanction the state, but you've already, had the risk. So I think maybe that's something to think about later, but it's really going to be crucial to build up these regimes around scientific norms and governance, and those might then provide the foundation for later regulation of the deployment.
No, I wanted to make that last point as well, and I think what this shows, I mean, the fact that you're raising two existing regimes, that geoengineering is extremely complex and affects many different parts of the oceans, of the atmosphere of the world, and therefore there are many possible ways in which this can be regulated or coordinated, and the risk there is that one ends up with a very fragmented overall regime. You're talking about an umbrella, that's all very nice. The risk with a fragmentation without an umbrella is that either things fall between the cracks or they're internally inconsistent, and also the question of compliance. I mean, what if people don't actually stick to the particular regimes that are out there? Is anything going to be done about it? And just as a thought experiment, if one major Arctic country starts putting stuff up in the atmosphere unilaterally, and this is going to have an effect on another major Arctic country in a way that some of the potential benefits of climate change that it was anticipating aren't actually materializing, in the absence of any of those umbrella regimes, my guess is that it sooner or later ends up in the Security Council.
Thanks.
Thanks for hosting this panel. My name is Bidisha Banerjee from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I have two questions. One is just really quickly, do you guys know anything about research into geoengineering in China. And the second question is about kind of national values and attitudes towards caution and how those can be accounted for within these international governance structures that we're talking about potentially creating. Because as we've seen with the GM issue and with the kind of way the precautionary principle has been deployed in Europe these days versus in the past, there can be really different national attitudes towards risk that can go on to influence the ways in which these structures are determined. Thanks.
Thank you.